Let's Take This Outside with Marianne Iveson, the podcast where she speaks to athletes, outdoor professionals, and scientists about why they connect with nature.
Meghan J. Ward is an outdoor travel and adventure writer based in Banff, Canada, a fellow of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society, and the author of Lights to Guide Me Home. Meghan has written several books, as well as produced content for films, anthologies, blogs, and some of North America's top outdoor, fitness, and adventure publications. She and her husband, photographer Paul Zizka, love to explore the wild and the world together and take their 2 young daughters along for the ride. Please welcome Meghan J. Ward. Meghan, welcome to Let's Take This Outside.
I'm so excited to be here with you.
So I saw that you were born in Calgary, but actually did not know this till I skimmed through your book, that you grew up in Ottawa in Canada, which is a suburb of Ottawa, which is hilarious. I actually had no idea till today. And that I happened to be interviewing you.
Yeah, exactly. My parents moved there when I was 5 weeks old. And so while I was born in Calgary, my childhood was definitely in Canada.
That's hilarious. So my first question is, where did your love of nature begin? Was it in Canada? Not a ton of nature in Canada, but where did it begin?
It really did begin in Canada because my folks were so fortunate to purchase a home when we got there that backs onto the Greenbelt system. And it's also on a cul-de-sac. And so we had no neighbors behind us, and we had the neighbors to the left and right, but not across. And right across the cul-de-sac was the old rail system that was turned into the bike trail that goes all the way downtown. Yeah, all out to Stittsville, downtown. So all these trails were used for biking in the summer, cross-country skiing in the winter. We had this forest behind the house that wasn't that big, but it was just enough that it was such a magical place to grow up because we would just escape there whenever we could. And back in the 80s and 90s, often, my parents didn't know where we were. They could probably kind of hear us, but we had this beautiful, unstructured, unsupervised relationship with the outdoors that's very hard to provide to children today. And so my love of nature really was on that Corey Trail system in Canada. That's where it all started.
That is so cool. And the fact that I biked there 1,000 times. I've probably walked exactly where you grew up. I always preach how wonderful Ottawa is for nature and how many activities you get into. What kind of stuff were you doing? So cross-country skiing, hiking, what were you partaking in?
I'd have to say the outdoor experience for me was really about outdoor play, sometimes through sport, especially in that forest behind the house. We would just do whatever we could. In the winter, sometimes because it's a marshland back there, it would freeze as a pond you could skate on through the trees. And I didn't really get into the outdoors the way we describe it now with hiking and paddling and all of that until I was in high school and I started doing outdoor education classes at my high school. And then it was my move to the mountains that really exposed me more to the outdoor culture that in some ways has also been highly commercialized, but that also really exposed me to this whole other kind of relationship we can have with the outdoors.
I want to go back to when you say unstructured, unsupervised, I think is what you said, play. I can relate to that growing up on a farm, just craziness, like acres of land, just doing whatever we wanted, right? What does unstructured, unsupervised play mean to you growing up in Canada?
Honestly, it's just as it sounds. There's no set program. There's no downloadable PDF that parents are following to help their kids do a scavenger hunt in the woods. My parents weren't even there. It was just me and my sisters and the neighborhood gang that would head out into the woods together and just have some fun, maybe a little bit of trouble sometimes. But, no one ever got hurt or anything like that. It was just, I think there was a certain level of trust in our society back then that allowed us the freedom to do that as well. Nowadays, if you've got kids scampering in the woods alone and someone comes by them, they might even give them a bit of a side eye being like, where are the parents? And my husband and I really encourage our kids. We now also back onto a forest here in Banff. And we really encourage our kids to go out and explore carefully and, with the kind of wildlife knowledge that they need to know living here that I didn't have to deal with back in Canada. But it truly was unstructured, spontaneous, unsupervised, just like this very pure, playful relationship with the natural world.
So fast forward, you're 21 years old, you decide to move to the Canadian Rockies. Where did this inspiration come from? And did any of it come from the fact that you were born in Calgary? Maybe your family talked about Calgary at all, or was it just a weird coincidence?
It was certainly multifaceted. I did grow up with an awareness of the mountains. My dad had worked out in the Rockies when he was in his late teens and had spoken so highly of that experience. He had grown up in Winnipeg. So certainly had the seed planted there, but it didn't have as much to do with Calgary or that being, where I was born. The summer before I first moved here, it was the summer after my first year of university at Queen's, and I was window washing. I had a fantastic group of friends to work with that summer, but the work itself became a little bit repetitive and monotonous. I think we washed 400 houses worth of windows that summer. And I describe in my book, Lights to Guide Me Home, actually, that I spent all this time up these ladders all summer. And maybe it was like kind of climbing these ladders and spending some time up high, but also doing something so monotonous that kind of made me dream of something bigger. And I originally asked my parents if I could stay in Kingston the next summer because I kind of just wanted something new. And I think it was my dad who said, I'd rather you be in BC than be so close to home, but not home. Like you might as well go far away if you're going to go. And that's what really kickstarted that process of moving to the mountains. And my cousin had worked at a lodge here in Banff National Park that summer that I was considering this. And again, spoke so highly of the experience. And I applied to the same lodge for the next summer with a good friend of mine, and we got hired and the adventure began.
What was the lodge?
The lodge at Bow Lake, formerly called Namtija, but it's been recently renamed to the Lodge at Bow Lake here in Banff National Park.
I don't even really need to explain how when you move to the Rockies and you fall in love with the mountains and you start doing a million activities and you make all these friends and you're like, oh, and then you just fall into things, right? You just fall into things. You fall in love with them. You fall in love with the air. I know it's probably a lot different now than it was when you were 21 years old, and you've traveled a lot since. But what did that look like for you in your 20s? Because there's no better time in your life to do that.
It was a truly life-changing decision. And when I made it, I had no idea what was coming for me. I wanted this adventure and this move to the mountains, but it just completely changed the course of my life. For one, I met my now husband the day after I moved there. He was working at Bow Lake. He'd worked there for numerous summers and the odd winter season. And he wasn't actually supposed to stay that long, but his plans changed. And we ended up connecting through the outdoors that summer. He was so acquainted with the Bow Lake region. He became my pseudo guide. And I think he enjoyed having someone who was so gung-ho to go out whenever I could. But yeah, you could say we fell in love. And it was also a time when I really started questioning my faith on a very deep level. I grew up in a religious family, the daughter of a Baptist minister. And meeting Paul was certainly a part of that shift, just exposing me to some different ways of being, thinking, living, experiencing. And I think I just, in some ways, I don't want to call it a Pandora's box quite, but that move opened something. And I spent that whole first summer feeling like I was out of my body, moving up these mountains and experiencing this new relationship with the outdoors, but also having a new relationship with myself that I don't think would have had I not left Ontario.
If you could describe what it brought out in you, Like, is there feelings that you could put into words?
For the first time in my life, I had permission to redefine myself. I had this permission to finally begin to let go of living for others, for living to please. I spent probably about 5 years in the church environment, not entirely buying it, but having had a whole childhood of training, you could say, and experience, I knew how to play the part. And I think I just broke free from so much. Truthfully, it took another 15 years to actually take that part of my life into my own hands more. And, I took not just from the faith community, but other things as well. And just some things that you grow up in a suburban environment, where there's certain opinions about how you should do things. In the mountains, especially Banff, it's just a community of misfits and people who've just carved their own way through this life. And it's so fascinating. And I think I just needed to expose myself to different people, different philosophies. And you could say some of it didn't even have much to do with the mountain environment, but I think the mountains really attract those people.
I don't know if you can tell, but I'm getting like a little emotional hearing you talk about that. So maybe not in the same way, but it could be the mountains, it could be just nature in general. And when you spend enough time in nature, how it totally transforms who you are and how you really feel connected, right? That's why I do it. That's why I go out. Sorry, I didn't mean to make this about me.
No, I
totally understand. I totally understand.
I love this conversation. This is what I'm all about. And I think the amazing thing about nature is it always meets us where we're at. And it also simultaneously invites us to move out of that, to free ourselves, to reinvent ourselves, to discover ourselves. We're always evolving. And why should we stay the same? And for me, the mountain environment, nature, forests, whatever it is, it's been like a landing pad. It's like, oh, there you are.
And it's always the landing pad, though.
Yeah, it never fails.
I don't think I've ever gone for a hike or gone outside or spent time in nature and felt worse. It always uplifts me. It always makes me feel better 100% of the time. It is just like the 100% instant guarantee fix, right?
Absolutely.
I'm going to go back to my question. But it's a part of this. You're a classic creative. You're a writer, an author, a filmmaker, a coach. What's it like to blend your love of nature and adventure in your work?
It's like a match made in heaven. There's a quote on my website that's attributed to Benjamin Franklin that says, either write something worth reading or do something worth writing. And this has been my approach to my creative life for the last 20 years, I'd say. Sometimes I have to learn to tone it down. It's hard for me to have experiences without this second brain going for descriptions and details. And so I've learned to mitigate that by just doing some journaling when I can, taking lots of little photos of like random things. I'm that person when we're traveling who's photographing the strangest signs and details because I want to be able to recollect later to utilize that. But it's just been such a privilege to marry these two passions of mine. Sometimes it comes with a little bit of a burden as well. It's hard to describe why that is, but I think other people in the situation would get it. I think it's because of that inability sometimes to turn off that part of my brain that's interpreting, describing, narrating. And sometimes I just want to be there and just live it without doing anything with it.
Is it almost like you have like a duty to be able to put into words what you're seeing for other people? Is that what that feels like?
Sometimes it's a bit of a duty. Other times I do have some articles that I write monthly, for instance, on my Substack. So I'm always looking for whatever the next inspiration is, and it's kind of one thing at a time. gratefully. It's not like I have to constantly be creating. I've set myself up that I write essentially one monthly piece there for my readers. I think it's also a privilege. I live an incredibly privileged life. And that comes from the family I grew up in, the economic situation I grew up in, my access to resources and education. And I think I've learned that what's important to me is to take the stance that because I can do these things, I want to. I don't want to waste a moment. I don't want to waste an experience. And I do like to try to repackage those experiences for my readers so that they can come away with something and think about some things for themselves.
Let's Take This Outside now has a newsletter. Keep up to date with outdoor news, events, and great discount codes and deals from our partners. Sign up today at letstakethisoutside.ca.
Is it safe to say you live almost like a 360 life of nature and writing and creativity? Because your husband, Paul, who's a photographer, it's not like you can get away from it in your married life either, right?
Yeah, you've definitely touched on something which requires a lot of boundaries. We've had to really learn how to park certain conversations at the door, set weekly meetings to talk about certain things so that we're not talking about them at the dinner table or when our kids get home from school. Yeah, I live and breathe creative businesses. I run a freelance business. I essentially am a large part of Paul Ziska Photography. It's a partnership. And I also work in marketing for Offbeat Photography, which is a company that we co-founded with Dave Brosha back in 2016. And we bring participants around the world for photography workshops. And so I'm deeply embedded in the business and the creative side of all of these enterprises. But I don't really believe in balance. I don't actually think it's something we can achieve. I think it's about daily decisions of how we're going to manage our time and setting parameters and constraints around that time and making sure that the important things are the non-negotiables. And so it does feel like a 360 experience a lot of the time. The last half year, I've been in what I would describe as a kind of follow period creatively, where I'm just doing a lot of thinking and reflecting and taking time to consider what my next steps are before launching into anything new on the writing front. So I think I'm also evolving a little bit in how I look at my creative life.
For the record, I'm going to ask him the same thing, by the way. We're chatting next week. So I don't want it to just be like, I'm asking the woman this, like, oh, what's it like to work with your husband? No, I'm asking him the exact same question, too.
I didn't actually answer that question either.
Okay, the actual question was, what's it like to work with your husband, who is also in the creative space, who's a nature photographer?
I mean, it's such an honor to watch him do his work. And I am his number one fan. And I've been with Paul since 2005. I've watched him start his photography career. I've seen him buy his first camera. I've been part of it from the beginning. And, of course, I'm extremely biased, but I'm forever impressed by his humility and the way he goes about his work. And it's been an incredibly hard journey together to essentially our family business is what has largely supported us financially for the last 10 years. And yeah, we've been through a lot together, navigating that world and figuring it out and essentially running a small business together. And, I think setting those boundaries around when certain conversations are allowed to happen is really integral in keeping things from getting overtaken by the potential stresses of work and also the good things. You can easily overshadow even our kids' experiences at home with us if we're always talking about work, even if it's about the good stuff. So it's been truly an honor. And I can't imagine my life without that part of it.
Some of my favorite interviews with women on this podcast is women who were professional athletes and then had kids and their lives shifted, right? And you were in the same space. You're adventurous, you meet the love of your life. You're adventuring all over the world together. And then you have not one, but you have two daughters. How old are they now?
They're 5, almost 6, and 11.
That transition must have been maybe the biggest transition of your entire life, I'm guessing. One of.
I would say it's up there with the previous transition we discussed around just really learning not to abandon myself anymore and really go after what felt right to me. But that lesson is inextricably entwined with the parenting lesson as well, of how we introduce kids into our lives and into the world without losing ourselves completely. And I mean, ultimately, this became the basis of the memoir that I wrote that came out back in September 2022 with Rocky Mountain Books, called Lights to Guide Me Home. It really chronicles my journey through marriage and motherhood as an adventurous spirit. And I don't feel like I hold back too much in the book from describing some of the more uncomfortable, disappointing, stressful, arduous moments amidst the joyful, transformative, next level joyful things you experience as a parent. And so Paul and I were never 100% sure that we wanted to have kids. And we didn't necessarily put it off for a long time, but we did date for 5 years before we got married. And so when we got married, we had a big year of adventure up in Ayutthaya National Park on Baffin Island and here in the Rockies. And we had 2 months of trekking in Nepal. And it was just the following year that we started to explore the idea more. And I remember we were out for a skate on the Bow River here in Banff and just starting to discuss it more and ultimately feeling like we didn't have many models in our lives of people who had gone down that path, like people like us who really valued their independence and freedom. And here we were freelancers too. Every weekend was a long weekend, out climbing, out hiking. And we just didn't feel like we had many models in our lives of what that could look like. So I actually set off on a project, like a blog that I called Adventurous Parents. And it no longer exists because ultimately it turned into the book. But I started interviewing other people I could find online about that transition that they'd been through and how they manage and how they keep pursuing the things that they love and keep pursuing adventure. And then it was in the midst of that we decided to go for it. And I got pregnant and it was kind of interesting because when I came out of all of that and we started trying to introduce our firstborn to this life that we loved, it went horribly. It's something I catalog in the book.
Thank you for being honest about that.
It went absolutely horribly. And I think I can chalk it up to a couple things. And one is that, no two kids are alike. And at some point I figured out that she was a rather spirited human being who is highly perceptive and at the time was very intense and didn't like transitions and, made sure that we knew that. And most of our efforts to go camping or anything were just disastrous. And we also decided that we would try traveling with her in her first year of life and set off on a 70-day island hopping experience through New Zealand and Niue and French Polynesia. And again, it was a grind. It was hard. We were trying so hard to keep our adventurous lives looking like they did before. And she had other plans for us. I think in some ways that solidified just how passionate we were about those things because we couldn't do them the way we wanted to. But it was just a matter of time and adjusting the way we traveled. So even the following year, we went to Belize, I think, for 3 weeks to the rather tiny island of Key Cocker and spent 3 weeks there at the same apartment and we got into the flow, and we actually had a really enjoyable time because we adjusted the way that we were traveling with her based on who she was and what she could tolerate. And things started to get better and better. By the time she was 4, we were finally able to go camping and do some of the things that we had been longing to do. It was so hard that it took us 4 years to decide to have another kid. And that's not only because of the adventurous piece. It was just because we were business owners, creatives, trying to also incorporate this child into our lives. We couldn't fathom it until she kind of got to an age where things were getting easier for us, that we decided to have another kid. And fortunately, we were, I guess, rewarded a little bit with that one. She was a bit more easygoing as a baby. When she was 9 months and my eldest was 5, we took them to Easter Island and just started, that really kickstarted some more adventurous travels for us and to destinations that we never would have dreamed of being able to go to as new parents. So it just goes to say, every person's journey is so individual, and you really can't compare experiences with other families or couples. And I think I wasted so much energy trying to keep up and try to prove something when obviously the universe had different plans for me. But now we've been to, I think, 35 countries with our kids, and we've explored the world in some pretty adventurous ways, in the ways that we enjoy doing ourselves as the adults in the mix. And we've also done some backcountry hiking and camping with the kids, and it's come, but it took a long time.
And it's only going to get better from here, right?
I think so, yeah.
I think you kind of already answered this, but do you have any advice for parents who do want to travel with their children, or maybe they're pregnant and they want to live this life that you and Paul had imagined before having your first?
The big takeaway from me was I spent a lot of time thinking and planning before I even met my child. And think of it as if you were going traveling with another adult who was a total stranger. There's very little that you would just be able to assume or that you would feel comfortable planning without getting to know them. And babies are no different. They come with a personality and preferences and needs that some other babies don't have. So I think just wait until you know what you're working with before you start thinking too big or going too far down that rabbit hole. So that would be one piece. And I think the biggest advice I have is just to build things incrementally. And a lot of people look at some of the things that we do and they say, I could never do that. But it's because we're already comfortable with these things just for ourselves. And so if you've never been camping, camp close to home for the first time with your kid.
In your backyard, right?
Totally. No, absolutely. Keep it super close to home before you go into even a drive-in campground, or before you do a week-long road trip, drive the next town over and see how that goes, and then go a little bit longer. It's just to say, kind of up the adventure quotient over time, which allows you to adapt and refine your systems. Now we're so dialed for our trips with our kids, whether it's hiking or traveling abroad. We have these systems in place. I know exactly what I need for this stage. I know what I don't need anymore because, there's no diapers. Now we're here. But I'm just not biting off more than I can chew anymore. Whereas that was definitely my mistake at the beginning. And I guess, there's so much advice that I'd love to give. But the third piece, I think part of it was I'm so fortunate to have a partner in the mix, and just really learning to pass the baton and share the load rather than doing everything together. It's very difficult to travel and get any alone time or time to go enjoy certain things when you're trying to do it all together all the time. And so I think it's healthy to spell each other off a little bit and kind of build that into your itineraries and just really work as a team that way. It was ultimately the answer to us starting to enjoy our trips more. So I might escape to a cafe to write for a little bit. Sometimes it's only an hour in 3 weeks, but it's something. And so that would be the third piece.
Your kids are still young, but do you have any dream trips that you're like, that we want to work up to this? Or is that going to spoil it by saying it out loud, do you think?
It won't spoil it. I'd like to start doing some destination hiking trips, like destination multi-day hiking trips. The last 3 years, we've actually spent their spring break in April exploring Eastern Europe by car. And so 2 years ago, we were in the Balkans, in Albania, North Macedonia, Montenegro, and Croatia. And last year, we went to the Baltic nations. And then I just got home from a road trip through Romania and Bulgaria. And there's certainly a lot of adventure that's infused into those experiences where you don't speak the language. In some countries, it's a Cyrillic alphabet, so you can't even read it, even if you could sort of understand it otherwise. And there's different customs and various things to negotiate. But I think I'd like to start looking at spending maybe a week doing a hike and we always look for nature wherever we go, but I'd like to experience more of the landscapes around the world. We've been in a lot of urban or historic urban settings. And it was in Bulgaria that we stopped in this town for the night unexpectedly. That's close to this archaeological reserve in Madeira that's actually a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and ended up spontaneously going on this remarkable little hike up to these cliffs and into these caves. And, I think I felt like I was in my happy place. And I love the old cobblestone cities and all of that. But I think I'd like to start incorporating more those types of outdoor experiences into our trips.
Tell me about your latest book, Lights to Guide Me Home. This sounds beautiful, and I can't wait to get my own copy.
Lights to Guide Me Home, essentially, like I said before, chronicles my journey through marriage and motherhood. It tracks 17 years of my life and how I transition through those phases of life as a person with an adventurous spirit. It takes the readers on a trip around the world. So it certainly has some components here in the Rockies, but we also go to Costa Rica and Nepal and Baffin Island and Malta and Ireland and Rapa Nui, also known as Easter Island. I think what I ended up doing with the book is tracking these parallel journeys, essentially using these experiences in these remarkable places to track the journey within as a woman learning to stop abandoning herself and just learning to kind of come home to herself again. And I think those are the real threads that weave throughout the book.
I can't wait to read it.
Thank you.
Meghan Ward, this has been one of the most emotional conversations maybe the most emotional conversation I've had on this podcast. Thanks for taking time. This has been wonderful. And now I can't wait to talk to your husband because I feel like it's going to be a very different experience, but I really can't wait to hear his side of the journey that parallels yours.
Thanks so much for this conversation. It meant a lot to me too.
Thanks for listening. For more Let's Take This Outside, go to letstakethisoutside.ca.
Produced and distributed by the Sound Off Media Company.